Next, I'd like to welcome, already, the very eager Dr. Travis Salway, who's going to be talking about constructing and expanding gay suicide narratives. For the one or two of you in the room who don't know anything about Dr. Salway, Travis Salway, MSc, PhD, is a social epidemiologist whose research focuses on health inequities experienced by lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. Travis is a Banting Research Fellow at the UBC School of Population and Public Health and the BC Centre for Disease Control, where he investigates health services solutions to elevated rates of depression, anxiety, suicide ideation, and substance use among LGBT Canadians. Travis's training spans social work, yay, UC Berkeley, clinical epidemiology, yay, McGill, and public health epidemiology, yay, at U of T, yay. He is a longstanding board member of the Community-Based Research Center for Gay Men's Health and a co-investigator of the National Sex Now Survey. So looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, David. Before we start, I want to acknowledge that any one of these three presentations alone is a lot to take in. Together in 1 hour and a half, it can be quite taxing on our own mental well-being and strength. So I want to point out that Alvaro and Aaron are here. Can you guys raise your hands? So Alvaro and Aaron are very graciously making themselves available throughout the summit. Folks need to talk, decompress, kind of digest some of what you're hearing. And those of us on the panel, we're also happy to talk to you afterwards. So please make sure that you take care of yourself, whether that means you have to step out of the room or talk to one of us after. The other preamble statement is that, like David said, my postdoc is really interested in health services, but I'm not going to talk about health services today, so this is a plug for my talk tomorrow, when I will try to answer the earlier question about what I think could be done from public health's perspective in responding to the issues that Sunny and Olivier have raised. But today, I'm going to tell you the story of my PhD research. And even though this started 5 years ago, it's still a work in progress. There's a lot I don't know. So if you feel like this ends on a cliffhanger, that's why. My interest in the topic of gay suicide started when I was working with Olivier and a few others on a Sex Now project that turned into the Provincial Health Officer's report on HIV trends in gay and bisexual men in BC. And what we saw in that report, as Olivier referenced, was that 1 in 6 gay and bisexual men in the country had attempted suicide. This really shocked me. I didn't understand how I could have spent 15 years as an out gay man working in gay men's health and never encountered this statistic. So I'm an epidemiologist, so I went to the data to see if this is true. And like Olivier mentioned, we saw at the time 75 primary research studies. There's now close to 100 that all collectively show, even today, even with gains in legal and social status for sexual minorities, we see 4 times higher rates of suicide attempts in gay and bisexual populations. So I started screaming about this and presenting these statistics to friends, to my family, to academics. I went to Extra News a few years ago. I presented it here at the summit for the first time 4 years ago. And I really, what really struck me was the range of reactions I got to this. So starting with my heterosexual friends and family and colleagues, a lot of them were really genuinely surprised by this statistic. They said, well, this must be an artifact. Maybe this was true 50 years ago, maybe 20, but now with all the progress, effective combination HIV treatment, gay marriage, or maybe they would say, okay, well, yes, we know, yes, teenagers are experiencing some very hostile bullying. But they were really surprised by the statistic as it applies to adults. Queer audiences had a much more diverse and nuanced reactions. A lot of folks expressed concern, including several of you sitting in the room here, Olivier. A lot of people really took this up and took it very seriously. Some people expressed resistance. No, we're doing fine, thank you. Please stop further stigmatizing us by attaching gay sexuality to suicide. A third group, exemplified by this quote that was on social media after the Extra piece, said, oh, I don't find the contention that homophobia, like Olivier said, homophobia as a cause of suicide, I don't find that credible. Personally, I believe there are more factors contributing to the problem within our community than any one external factor like homophobia. So kind of questioning, like, well, what's going on internally rather than looking out to heterosexual society. So my response to this was immersing myself in the topic. I started volunteering at the Suicide Prevention Hotline at the Crisis Center. I made this my PhD topic. Thanks for your help, David. And I worked with national surveys. I did interviews with gay men who'd attempted. I started talking to my friends about this, and I found that that 1 in 6 statistic, in fact, bears out in my social circles. So this whole process brought me to narrative research, which is what I'm going to talk about today. Because narrative research is a way of making sense of when we're hearing very different stories about the same topic. And this is what I want you to take with you. First, that we cannot understand the causes of sexual minority suicide without understanding how stories about sexual minority suicide are constructed and shared. Stories are a function of time, place, and audience. So in fact, the story I'm telling you today is different than the story I told at my PhD defense 6 months ago, even though they're ostensibly talking about the same thing. It's about context. And I really believe, and I'm encouraged by the work that Sunny and Olivier presented, because I think that this is a major step along the way. I think we can help those who are suffering by learning to hear more stories. And this is what I want to do today. I want to challenge the idea that there's a single explanation for the statistic I showed you, and hopefully get all of us, myself included, to doubt or resist someone who tells you that there's a single narrative. So first, a little bit of definition. What do I mean when I say story or narrative? These terms, of course, they're often interchanged, but just for my talk today, I want to pick them apart a little bit. So I would call a story a unique individual account of personal experiences and events. So Dorothy's particular return trip to Oz and back to Kansas is a story. It's a familiar one. We've all heard it, but it's a particular one. By contrast, narratives are more basic, general templates. They're passed through cultural communications, by which I mean films, books, conversations that you're having with your gay friends, the news, the gay press, the mainstream press, and what we're doing at the summit this week. These are all cultural communications that help really cement these different kinds of narrative templates. So Dorothy's story is beautiful and unique, but it's not new. It's borrowing a template known as the quest narrative or the journey narrative that's been shared repeatedly across many cultures for many centuries. So stepping back then, what am I doing in terms of the data that I'm working with, the process I've been going through throughout my PhD? Well, it turns out there's a medical sociologist who works in Calgary named Arthur Frank, who has written a lot about this. His book is called Letting Stories Breathe. The approach is called dialogical narrative analysis. And the basic tenet is that all of the stories we tell have underlying narratives, and the more we can describe them and talk about what they're actually being used to do, the more powerful our analysis will be. So I used 3 questions throughout my qualitative research project. I wanted to know, every time I encountered a narrative, what are the elements of it? Because stories have beginnings, they have middles, they have ends. So what does the structure look like? What's the genre? Who are the characters? And then number 2, how did the narrative position or preclude suicide, in particular in relation to sexuality, right? We know there's lots of causes to suicide, but what's going on here that 4 times as many gay people should be attempting suicide than straight people? And third, I wanted to know its effect. Stories generally serve purposes, and storytellers involve at least 2 people, a teller and a listener, and here storytelling involves a much bigger group, and stories have that in mind. So who does a story serve and how? My data were first and foremost the things I've heard and read about gay suicide over the course of my life. So this includes books like the one by Eric Rofus in the 1980s, Michel Doré, who's a social worker from Quebec, who wrote a book about 15 years ago on the topic. It also includes articles like the ones in Extra about gay suicide, responses to articles, for example, on Reddit, and Live Through This, which is a database compiled by Desiree Stage, who's an activist in the US. She's collected stories and videos from 166 suicide attempt survivors. And Olivier's project, and all of, the more we're talking about this, the more all of these stories are coming out. I also did interviews with 7 adult gay men who attempted suicide 18 times between 1977 and 2013. The interviews were very unstructured, but I started out just by saying, hey, here's the statistic that I have on hand. 1 in 5 gay and bisexual men have attempted suicide. Why do you think that might be? And there were just 2 questions in the interviews that generally took about 2 hours. So they started just by telling me the story of their suicide attempts. And then I asked them, what do you see with this connection between sexuality and suicide? What's going on here, if there is a story at all? I will only have time to tell you about 3 narratives. There's tons more in these 7 interviews, and if you're interested, come talk to me. I'm happy to share other stories. But I'm going to focus on 3 narratives that have really stayed with me, and they've come up again and again. So I'll argue these are probably the most durable of the gay suicide narratives out there, although of course there are others, and I would love to hear after if you want to share things that you've heard. And I heard individual stories from each of my participants drawing on these larger narratives, but the participants didn't create the narratives, right? They're referencing them, they're using them to help get across their stories and their needs. The first and probably most familiar narrative is social stress. And this is exemplified by the stories of Alan Turing and Billy Lucas. So Turing, many of you will know, was a British mathematician credited with developing the modern computer. His story was repopularized as a heroic tragedy a few years ago. In the film The Imitation Game. Turing had sex with men in Britain at a time when this was a crime, and so he was forced to receive hormonal treatments to reduce his libido. And in 1954, he died by poisoning himself with cyanide. Billy Lucas, shown on the right, was from Greensburg, Indiana. His story is really close to my heart because Greensburg is just a few miles from my hometown in Ohio. And he faced increasingly hostile bullying at school in response to his perceived sexuality, and in the fall of 2010, he died by hanging himself in his family's barn. These 2 stories would leave you with the impression that the social stress narrative is either a product of a bygone era in which homosexuality was a crime, or else it's specific to struggling teenagers. As Olivier referenced earlier, that idea about teenage queer suicide is very well entrenched. But actually, this narrative shows up for adults as well. It's increasingly being endorsed by practitioners and counselors who see the enduring cumulative role minority stress has played in their patients' lives. The American Psychological Association has created practice guidelines that specifically respond to this narrative for use with lesbian, gay, and bisexual clients. And one of the men that I interviewed, the 61-year-old man, really summed it up very eloquently, making the connection for himself. He said, "I sometimes wonder if this is all post-traumatic stress, about having to live through the whole secret of being gay, coming out, becoming bankrupt, divorced, things like that. And when I'm cycling really low, it gets overwhelming, and I can't cope. That's where I'm going to harm myself. But with 20/20 hindsight, if I was comfortable being gay at an earlier age, would all this have happened? Invariably, I'm inclined towards saying no." Now, it would have been, if not easy, it would have been comfortable to leave my talk at this point. Most researchers in this field agree that minority stress plays a big role in the 4-fold higher rates of suicide in queer adults that I showed you earlier. But the problem is, this is not the only explanation. As you've already heard today from Olivier, there's a lot more going on. The next most familiar, albeit surprising to me, narrative that came out in my participant stories was the pride narrative. This narrative has been essential, even life-saving for many of us queer people for decades. I'm sure everyone knows this narrative, but I'll tell you the story arc for the sake of presentation. So it goes like this. Society stigmatizes the gay protagonist who has to find a way to reject the stigma and proudly claim a gay identity. So if the social stress narrative, exemplified by Alan Turing's story, is a tragedy, the pride narrative's genre is romance. After Billy Lucas died in 2010, and 3 other teenagers died in the context of homophobic bullying in 2010 in the US, Dan Savage and Terry Miller used this narrative to launch one of the most successful social media video projects in recent memory. It gets better. They created 50,000 videos viewed by over 50 million people. That's an intervention. Celebrities, employers, professional athletes, politicians, everyone loves this narrative. It's very happy. In my interviews, it even showed up in places where I didn't want to see it. So here's a quote from Alan, who was 39 years old. Just a warning, this quote has some pretty intense language. He talked about his dad. He had a really difficult relationship with his dad, and his dad would repeatedly say things like, "Gay guys are a bunch of mentally sick fruits. They should be taken out to an island in the Pacific and should be annihilated." He talked about a time when we were sitting there, both my parents one day were visiting, and a show came on. There were 2 gay guys, and they mentioned that these 2 are a gay couple, and my dad suddenly said, "If I ever found out one of my kids was a fruit, I'd disown him for my will." This was clearly a trauma and stress kind of narrative to me. I wanted it to be. I wanted to understand a lot of Alan's struggles in relation to this historic trauma relating to homophobia. But when I asked Alan, well, what about the connection between sexuality and suicide? He said, oh, other people have asked me, does your suicide attempt have anything to do with the fact that you're gay? I said, no. Being gay had nothing to do with my suicide attempt, absolutely nothing. I know that some people commit suicide when they realize they're gay. It's like, what's wrong? I'm going to shoot myself. I never felt that way. That's what kept me going. Alan clings to the pride narrative, and why shouldn't he? It's keeping him alive. It's hopeful, and this was a really big lesson for me about making space for some of the other stories that come up in the context of gay suicide. The third narrative was there in the data all along, but its prominence really didn't become clear to me until I did some work with Mike Hobbs, who wrote a piece for the Huffington Post this past spring. I think Mike is here today. I saw him somewhere, so maybe we can ask him to share his thoughts. But he wrote a piece called Together Alone, The Epidemic of Gay Loneliness. And in the first half of the piece, Mike talks a lot about this trauma and stress narrative. He really tries to understand what is it about those stressors from heterosexual society that, quote unquote, get under our skin, that they stay with us. But in the second half, he sheds light on the stressors within the queer community, what I would call the brittle umbrella. I thought of this, I read a paper by sociologist or psychologist Ruth Fassinger. From one of her participants' quotes, it said, "I'd rather get wet than stand under that umbrella," which is an expression of this sort of anxiety or uncertainty about, do we all still fit under this quote-unquote queer umbrella? Like the social stress and pride narratives, this is not only about suicide. This is ubiquitous. I've heard it referenced already 10 times today. And it goes like this: as the social and legal status of queer people is changing in North America and comparable societies, the within population dynamics are also changing. It's less clear how a single queer umbrella can hold us all. And this creates a tension, it creates rifts, leaving some people behind. In the case of my interviews, because I was talking primarily to older white gay men, the focus was on generational divides. The question was, what does a post-gay identity do for others underneath the brittle umbrella, and how does it implot suicide? Well, one of my participants, who really changed my whole approach to the study, came in just really prepared to answer this question. He knew, he had a story ready to go. He knew exactly why we were seeing the statistic I showed him. So I asked him, well, when we started the interview, you reminded me of the ad that you saw, and you said, I know why. So if you had to summarize in a few sentences, how would you describe it? So here's Jerry's description. I believe that gay men today are being erased. We're supposed to be initialized under LGBTQ, but in the din, we're being erased. The closure of the traditional locations where we had colonized so we could meet together safely. The baths, the bars, the discos, they're closing. We've seen the fall of gay culture. We have been so assimilated, which is probably a mistake. History will prove this has been a mistake for us. And I think that older gays don't know what's hit them, right? So I'm not sure what the answer is, because with all respect to Savage and It Gets Better and all that shit, it's not getting better. I think for the sake of preserving life, we need a whole new focus from the older gay male and maybe lesbian groups to intervene here. I've worked in suicide prevention for several years now, and I know very well that the causes of individual suicides are very often indeterminate. We cannot know what complex interaction of factors leads an individual to take their life. But by contrast, what I'm trying to show you is that our collective understandings of how suicide affects a group, such as gay men, are very much identifiable. These understandings are not pure products of science or theory. They're not esoteric. They're prevalent, and they're products of our broader conversations about things like heterosexism, pride, and intersectionality. So what should we do? Well, first, for the people who are struggling with thoughts of suicide, of course we need to listen, we know that. But we need to listen really carefully, because there's not a single definable type of intervention that's going to work. I suspect that Alan would resist the kind of minority stress-informed cognitive behavioral therapy that's endorsed by the APA. Jerry is asking for a very different kind of intervention here, something along the lines of intergenerational organizing and storytelling rather than a traditional suicide-related intervention. Those of us here at the summit can help by making room for more narratives. I suspect we've only scratched the surface with what I've shared today. As I mentioned, I'm going to leave you with a cliffhanger. I'll tell you my recommendations for what I think we should do tomorrow. And I want to thank my supervisors at the University of Toronto, in particular David and Dion, who are here at the summit, and Anne, who is not. Olivier has been a constant support to me throughout this process. I also want to thank Craig, Terry, and Rick from the CBRC, and 3 of the counselors from him who are here today, Darren, Brian, and Aaron, who gave me a lot of support and made themselves available to the participants if they needed support. And with that, I'll end, and I'm happy to take any questions or disagreements. Thanks.
Great, so we definitely have time for comments, thoughts, questions.
John from Nova Scotia. The piece on narratives is so potent, especially coming from a cultural perspective. I think we call it only the narrative here, and I often fight with academics when it comes to use of narrative in academic research. There are folks out there that just look at it as, you know, folklore and mythology and just storytelling. And in fact, in the project that I'll be talking about tomorrow about coming out stories, there is spirit in story that we celebrate, and the lived experience, the continuity of that experience and retelling of that story is part of cultural knowledge and passing down or passing on that information. So we celebrate it, we use it, and it's more than just a method. It's our way of looking at our cultural survival. In suicide ideation, we look at it from a cultural perspective, and we didn't go in the approach that a lot of the folks are sharing the narrative here, saying, let's look at the causes of suicide. We're looking at the causes of resilience and the model of survival in our story. And I think as a plug, it'll be tomorrow at the, at the final presentation, but that narrative and that story that we're gathering is part of our cultural continuity as well, to understand that without the story, we wouldn't understand where we're going or coming from and where we're going in the future when it comes to mental suicide prevention. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. I'm looking forward to your talk tomorrow.
Hi, Aaron from HIM. I was struck by the last quote. Obviously, the kind of one that stuck out was this, the spaces concept, and it's something that you and I, Travis, have talked a lot about, these notions of spaces, community belonging, you know, where do people go, even the you know, degradation of what once was within queer communities or gay male communities, the bars, the baths, the saunas, etc. They are closing and changing, but what it brought up for me was even the similar calls that are coming from our you know, queer, trans, black, indigenous, mixed people of color who are saying kind of the same thing, but saying that for that younger generation who is doing this amazing work in consultation, and like that we presented last year, or we didn't, but my colleagues did present on this last year, was the idea of spaces for those people as well. And those absolutely don't exist. And so I think that it's interesting that when I hear both sides of the narratives, I hear, as a person who gets to do a lot of kind of intake interviews and talk with a lot of people, I get to hear from the people who are saying, I really miss the gay bar experiences because that's where I felt like I got to belong. And then there's young indigenous people of color who are saying, I've never found a space where I can be around people who are like me, who get it, who understand, and that space is a space where I feel comfortable being, because in large part those same spaces that the older generation or this other generation is saying we're missing this is not inclusive to those people. So that's a tension worth being uncomfortable with and thinking about and centering in our practices, I think, as organizational leaders, is moving forward that agenda as well. Because it is a very similar narrative, but a different, an absolutely different perspective and origin.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Aaron. I completely agree. I think the only thing I'll say about that is, as far as I can tell, the number of people in our society who identify as queer, gay, bi, two-spirit, trans is growing. So I spend a lot of time scratching my head about why we have fewer physical spaces. And I think, you know, my takeaway from this is, we can't just have one. We need a lot of very, very different looking kinds of spaces and events. And yeah, I'm worried about that. That's a very different kind of intervention than we typically talk about, so I'm glad that you brought it up because it needs to happen.
The only reason I would just follow up with saying consumerism. You know, if those spaces that we mentioned they require a high degree of like cash to keep the bars and spaces open, and that is a huge driver as inflation occurs and as business becomes that much more vicious. Obviously, businesses which once also gathered money, whilst creating a space as a kind of secondary benefit, that's something also worth considering, is that the economies that benefit those certain people. But I completely agree, and I agree about the nature of spaces clearly needs to shift, as far as I'm concerned. But it's a difficult one to consider, and they are vanishing. Even there are programs that did create space for people, and those programs became defunded and disappeared.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's remember this so that next year at the summit we can have a session on spaces, queer spaces.
It'd be excellent. Yes.
Thank you. This has been really riveting. As a man of color, a gay man of color myself, and clearly a visual minority at that, in all senses of the words, this topic has really hit home for me, especially when we're talking about spaces. So it's true, physical spaces have become passé, and everything's moved to social media and phone apps. And I seem to recall a couple of years ago here at the summit, the conversations were around stigma and shame around, no fats, no femmes, and all of this kind of terminology that's being utilized on social media. And it's my biggest beef with our community is that we as a community as a whole, we have problem with mainstream society stigmatizing and marginalizing us and bashing us, gay bashing, but then within our community there's a lot of bashing as well, right? So there's discrimination is discrimination across the board. It's ice cream. It's it's either chocolate or it's vanilla or it's strawberry, but it's ice cream. Ice cream is ice cream, different flavors. So I sit here and I look around, and I mean even look around the room. I mean there's very few men of color, represented, and why is that? Right? Why is that? I mean I have my own narrative and my own story of suicide ideation as well. Coming out in a community, in a faith group that's not accepting at all. I don't fit in the Sikh community because clearly I'm different, jewelry and what have you. I come to the gay community and I don't fit because I have a turban on my head, and it's like, you don't belong here. So where do I belong? Right? And so my question, I guess what I'm bringing attention back to a couple of years ago, and that communication and focus that we had at the summit around the shame that exists within our community and the discrimination that exists within our community, and what are the efforts that are being made towards reducing that? Yeah. So we keep talking about the community at large and society at large, but what about change starts at home? And I'm not seeing a lot of change starting at home yet. And so how many years upon years upon years are we going to see go by, and that change isn't happening from within?
Thank you, Jazzy.
It leaves me a little bit hopeless, to be quite frank.
Yeah, I thank you for reminding us of that. I think it does need to be brought back again and again here at the summit and in all of our conversations. I think... Yeah, I completely agree. And
I would say it's a challenge. I applaud him for opening up clinics and centers in Surrey, for instance, and doing some more press media, et cetera, with colored people featured. And my hope is that having a clinic or having space in remote areas like Surrey, Langley, et cetera, that some more men of color who are maybe still closeted are coming out and accessing services. And so what about bringing them into the inner folds of spaces like this? Yeah. We need more presence. We need them to start getting the education as well that's necessary. I mean, I've been working in the field for long enough, and that's why I come.
Yeah.
I'm kind of on the fringes at the moment, but I'm still here. Last year I wasn't. But I'm here because this is near and dear to my heart, and I feel like there are other folks out there that we need to bring in, and we need to incorporate into these narratives and these stories. I mean, storytelling, I think, it was discussed this morning as well, it's age-long, right? The intergenerational storytelling. So in that sense, like, I feel like, yeah, people could probably learn as well from my experience of coming out within the community of Surrey. But where are they? Where are they to be found? They're not coming out because they don't feel safe. So we need to try and create more safe space for people of color to come out, so that they feel held and supported and not suicidal.
Thanks, Jazzy, and thanks for coming back and for raising this really important point.
I just want to thank you. So before we wrap up, we're a little over, but I just want to take a moment and ask folks to just sit for a few seconds quietly, because there are lots of voices, lots of people, lots of spirits and lots of energy that are not here at the moment for a whole bunch of reasons that got discussed in this session. So I just want us to each take a second to call those people to mind and to bring them here. Great. Thank you for that. I want to thank you all for your time and attention. In particular, I want to thank these three amazing human beings for bringing your work today. We have our work cut out for us, so let's get a little nourishment and a break. And then the plenary for this afternoon is back in this room at 3:45. Thank you all.